presentation is about the social role valorization theme of interpersonal identification. But what do we mean by interpersonal identification? What we simply mean is people identifying with one another, coming together perhaps, or identifying with one another based on similar interests or similar hopes, similar experiences, similar dreams. When we talk about identification, we are not using this in the sense that you would lose your own unique identity. In fact, when we identify with other people, it can increase or enhance your own identity. I'll tell you a story. When I had just finished university and I met Dr. Wolfensberger, and I saw in him some things that I had in myself. So he had passion, commitment, and hope for justice for people with disabilities. And he inspired me, and I could see myself in him. And so I decided I really wanted to learn more from him and had the opportunity to learn a lot from him, which then I integrated into my identity, and it combined with what I knew. And so it just enhanced, that interpersonal identification enhanced my identity. So why is it important? Well, there are some practical implications of interpersonal identification that I think we can all easily understand. If people identify with one another, generally they're going to want good things for one another. If we identify with one another, then usually we want to be with each other, at least spend some time with each other. If we identify with someone, then usually we're thinking good things about that person, and we communicate good things about that person. And lastly, an implication, a practical implication of interpersonal identification is that when we identify with someone else and that person identifies with us, possibly we want to even model some of the characteristics of that person. And so when I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking about a very good friend of mine. We met in university in our freshman year at one of those very big classes. It was a required class, and it was in a really large lecture hall, and there were most likely at least 200 students in that lecture hall. And it was a long class, so we got a break in the middle of it, and I stepped outside to get a breath of fresh air and kind of stood by myself, and another student walked up to me and introduced herself, and we began talking about the course. And right away, you see, we had some familiar experience because we were both new students in the university. We were new to university, and this was the first time in our class, and it was kind of an overwhelming class. And so that's what we started talking about. And every time we had the class, we would, Paula is my friend's name, Paula and I would get together on breaks, and then we started doing assignments together and spending time together outside of class, doing other kinds of things in addition to focusing on that classwork. And from our identification with each other, which was just really quite a small moment at first, a friendship has developed that has lasted for years. So that's really the power of interpersonal identification. Now, we can't make identification happen. We can't say to somebody, you identify with that person. But what we can do is create possibilities to promote that identification. And so there are a number of strategies we can think of to create those possibilities. The first one being improving the approachability of each person with one another. If people have the opportunity to be together in typical and familiar ways, in typical and familiar places, engaging in activities together where there's a similar interest or goal, that alone, just that being approachable and being with each other creates the possibility that there might be some identification that will take place. In contrast to an example that I am familiar with where a post-secondary initiative for students with disabilities have separate classes and even separate floor in the dorm for the students with disabilities. So there's really not much opportunity for the students with and without disabilities to come together around things that they might have in common to build that identification. So we want to create the likelihood that when students are together, that the contact is positive, okay? So one of the things to think about is it can be very overwhelming if students are brought together in very large groups to identify with each other, right? But if you meet somebody one person at a time or a couple people at a time or in a small group, it's much more likely that you will engage with one another and maybe start over a period of time to find things that you have in common with one another, which may help you to identify with each other. People can help one another to meet other people that they might identify with. So I'm thinking about when my daughter went to university, there was a graduate student who acted as an advisor to her in a way. And so Josie showed Mary all around the campus and showed her how you could access different places in the campus, such as different student centers and the different activities that were available on campus. And Josie, because she was a grad student and had been at the university for a couple of years, knew a lot of people. And she was able to introduce Mary to a number of people, and particularly people who had interests in common with Mary's interests. So, for example, Josie was a theater major, and that's what Mary studied. And so Josie was able to introduce Mary to other students who worked in the theater, loved the theater. And out of that group of people, Mary met some people who really could identify with her interests, she could identify with their interests, and a relationship developed. Also, the Women's Center, Josie introduced Mary to the Women's Center, and Mary found a number of women and activities actually in the Women's Center where she just really enjoyed being with women, had some of these women's similar interests, and there was kind of, you know what I mean, that click between them, and some relationships developed there as well. We could think about assisting all students to engage in experiences that help them to see the world through one another's eyes. So putting yourself in the shoes of the other person, trying to understand the perspective of the other person, and actually maybe experiencing some of the things that another person experiences gives rise to empathy. And what is empathy? That's the ability to understand and share feelings of another person. And so empathy helps people to identify with one another. If you can identify with similar experiences, positive or not so positive. For example, rejection is an experience that I think everybody has had in one way or another. And so that's an experience that one human being can identify with another human being about the impact of rejection in one's life. Or being put down. I think all of us have had experiences with that. And so that's an experience that, in fact, we can identify with one another in terms of the pain of being put down. Engaging in shared experiences together, particularly if they are intensive ones, can give people the opportunity to really put themselves in one another's shoes. So, for example, doing a course of study overseas. Those kinds of courses of study tend to be pretty intensive. I know that Arcadia University in Pennsylvania does a lot of those different kinds of overseas trips. And I remember doing them also, doing a course of study overseas as a graduate student. And it was a very intensive experience. A small group of students went together. We studied really hard our professors had very high expectations, and plus we were learning another culture. And so we really, this group of students who did not know each other before we went on this overseas course together, came to know each other quite well and to identify with one another. So it moved, the experience in relationship moved from just knowing one another, being together, to really identifying with one another as students doing this intensive experience together. As well, we can, in terms of creating possibilities to promote interpersonal identification, we can think about what are we doing to foster the sense of students' responsibility for one another throughout the campus, building community on a campus. You know, is there a value, a belief, an ethic that we are a community of learning and each person here is important and has something to offer, and that we actually do need one another. In a place that's trying to build community, that creates all kinds of possibilities for not only people to come together, but to move to the next step of really identifying with people around similar experiences, shared interests, and so forth. Do we have opportunities for students to assist one another? For example, orientation, where the students who have already been in the program will help with the orientation, or have already been in the place of higher learning, will be advising students who are coming as freshmen. So here would be just some examples of creating those possibilities to promote interpersonal identification. The first picture, you can see the whole group of people standing together, talking with each other, and this is a conference that a group of students got together and organized on voting rights for anybody who was interested in voting rights. And so, you know, that group of students who came together with this similar interest and sponsored that conference really were identifying with one another and brought people together who could also identify with each other based on their concern about voting rights. The picture next to it is a group of students who are engaging in a very intensive kind of assignment together. And the assignment is that they are to learn about one another's heritages and to identify the differences in their heritages and then the similarities that they all have as human beings and also as students attending the same college. And the example below is a social justice group on a campus where the members there are learning about different groups of people within society who are represented on the campus who experience injustice and bias. And they're really trying to understand that experience and put themselves into the shoes of one another and other students on the campus who are dealing with injustice. And so here's an example. We not only do we want to promote opportunities for students to identify with one another, but for instructors and faculty to identify with the students and the students to identify with the faculty. And so this is an example of that. One student who has spent has had a lot of conversations with this professor that you see pictured here, and if you ask them the question about identification, they would talk about how they have learned to understand things from one another's perspective. So we want to bring it all together here by showing this last picture that really, I think, talks about or speaks to all of the different points that we listed around creating possibilities for interpersonal identification to happen. So here's a student in regular classes with other peers who are studying the same thing. They all have the same assignments, and students are assisting one another. They're meeting in familiar places, doing familiar things. And what do they have in common that helps them to identify with one another is that they are students in this class and they have work that they need to do together. So in conclusion, here are a few questions that I pose to you to think about and discuss together. first of all, what are we doing to create the possibility that students will identify with students around their interests, feelings, experiences, and so forth, that students will identify with professors, instructors, advisors, and that the professors, instructors, and advisors will identify with the students. And thank you very much for listening, and we hope that you've gained some ideas on how to promote interpersonal identification.